I guess I should probably state my qualifications for every tier before we start. S class means I think the fight is perfect or near perfect. A class means I think it's a really good fight, but it has like one or two kind of small details about it that keep it from near perfection. B, I'd just say would be above average. C, I'd say would just be average slash forgettable. I'd say D would be bad, but at least somewhat acceptable boss fights, and trash tier would be it literally doesn't even feel like a fight. Although I'm pretty sure there's only going to be one enemy or one boss that I'm actually going to put in the trash tier. Hi prepaying, welcome to this total meme of a stream. Okay, now that I finally got the disclaimer out of the way, let's get this going. Alright, first boss I see here, Abyss Watchers. I'm gonna put them at an A. I think they're a really good fight, especially for where their place is in the game. I think they're the first real skill test to the player. They look cool, they have interesting moves, it's an interesting take on a gank fight that's fair to the player. The one little thing that I think keeps it from being an S is that they have pretty much no poise whatsoever. Like you can pretty much stun lock them into oblivion, which I think makes it a bit too easy. If they had more poise, I'd probably put them in the S tier. Alright, moving on. Oh, looks like these are in alphabetical order. Next boss, Alderic. I'll put it at a B. I think it's an above average fight. Can definitely catch you off guard if you don't know how to properly handle it. What with all the arrows and magic spam. What's keeping it out of the A tier in my opinion is that I think the melee attacks could have been a lot better. Like, if Aldrich misses with the melee attack, then he literally just sits there for like upwards of 10 seconds and lets you freely wail on him, which I think makes it a bit too easy. Like, I think if they just made it to where after he whiffs a melee, he immediately teleports away, then I'd probably put him up more, but otherwise, I'd say it's an above average boss fight. Alright, moving on to what is probably going to be the only actual trash tier boss in the game, Ancient Wyvern. Yes, I know I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I don't care. The reason it's in the trash tier is because it literally doesn't even feel like a boss fight. It it's basically just a run to a boss fight. Like the trash mobs are the only chance of death you have here if you have any idea what you're doing. And you know, I wouldn't mind it that much if there was actually a viable way to fight him without doing the one hit kill. But if you try to kill him normally without doing the plunging attack, it is so slow, it is so tedious. He has a mountain of health and takes greatly reduced damage unless you hit the head, which is really hard to do. So it'll just be you sitting there chipping away at his ankles for upwards of like 10 minutes, avoiding his one-off super slow shitty bite and occasional fire breath. If they just made the regular fight outside of that at least half decent, I would have put it a lot higher. But your options are either one-shot it or a very slow, very tedious chipping away at its health from the ankles. Fuck that fight. Oh, speaking of Champion Gundyr, he's next on the list. And you know what? I'm actually putting him in the S tier. I think Champion Gundyr is a very high quality boss. I think of him as kind of the anti-noob boss. And what I mean by that is he actually forces you to get fairly good at dodging and rolling or parrying. But he pretty much it's hard to do any noob cheese strats against Champion Gundyr. You can't use magic from a distance. He covers a lot of ground really fast. You can't block. He absolutely eats away at your stamina. Most of the champs. Yeah, true, Jenny. The second phase of Champion Gundyr is truly something special. It is a true test of your close quarters combat in this game. He kind of nullifies all of the noob strategies. For that, I think he deserves an S tier ranking. Alright, next up, we have Discount Sif. I'll give this a C. Not really too much to say about the fight. The start of it's kind of shitty, where you get ganked by dogs or wolves, but they're really just reskinned dogs, and an enemy that's basically not even as good as the NPC summons you get throughout the game. But the wolf fight itself is at least passable as a boss, I'd say, with his fast moves and his ice breath and all that. I'll give it a C. It's passable, but pretty forgettable. Alright, moving on. I'm gonna put Crystal Sage in the D tier. It's quite possibly the most forgettable fight in the game, in my opinion. There's so many things they could have done to make this better. Like, let's see, instead of making him completely immobile until he teleports, like, why couldn't they have just made him move around more and given him, like, a wider variety of magic attacks? It's basically just super forgettable and boring. He literally just sits in one spot, casting the same super telegraphed magic attacks over and over. And then when he teleports, you just sit there for like 10 seconds waiting for him to appear. Pretty shit boss, but I mean, it at the very least feels like a fight, unlike Ancient Wyvern, and for meeting that very low criteria, I'll give it a D. Oh yeah, and then he respawns as a normal enemy in the archives, which I think he's actually far more threatening there, because he actually fires his spell from a spot that's pretty well protected, and he can fire spells at you from above. I actually think that's a much better fight than the actual boss fight. Okay, moving on. First Rotted Greatwood. Yeah, I'm gonna go with a D on this one as well. Its attacks consist of basically rolling around to try to crush you, which is super telegraphed. And I guess the arm that it spawns in the second half of the fight at least makes it somewhat interesting, kind of. But I mean, unless you're going for the main ball sacks that are under the arm, it can't even touch you. And then it just has lame stall attacks with like the acid diarrhea that just makes you stand away from it for a long time. It's just a really dumb, lame fight. Okay, moving on. Oh, Dancer. I'm giving the Dancer an A rating here. Pretty high quality fight. The Dancer probably has some of the most erratic and hard to read moves in the game. Also, the Dancer definitely has the second thickest booty in the series, second to the Asylum Demon, of course. But I really like the attacks. Uh, I think the thing that kind of keeps it out of the S tier is that don't. Oh yeah, you're right. Smo. How could I forget Smo? He is also pretty thick. You're right. Good call. But the thing that keeps it from perfection is I really think that the non-stop spin bullshit it does is kind of dumb and pointless. Like, it's super telegraphed, and if you know it's coming, it's just, oh, okay. Stand still for about 10 seconds on the other side of the room while it finishes doing that. And if you get close, then you pretty much just insta die. Like, I think what could have made it a lot better would be with the helicopter attack that I like to call it. If instead of being telegraphed, it was just, I don't know, easier to roll out of the way of. Those are just my thoughts. Alright, moving on. Oh, I'm probably gonna trigger Jenny with this, but I'm only gonna give Madeir an A tier reading. I think it's a pretty high quality boss, but let's be honest here and talk about some of his downsides, which are minor, but I think it's enough to keep it out of the S tier. So, I will give Madeir credit. If you're new and don't know what to expect, he is pretty counterintuitive to what a noob would expect. Like, a noob would intuitively probably try to fight him from underneath because that's usually how the big monster fights work. So I'll give him credit for that. But if you're an experienced player, then I honestly think the fight is a bit too easy. His attacks are all very super telegraphed, and they're always the same combos, so if you know what you're doing, I actually think it's a pretty straightforward fight. Not completely free because he does have a gargantuan amount of health and he hits really hard. So if you do screw up just once, then you're likely to die. But honestly, when I fight him now, I honestly just get kind of bored because it's like, oh, he's doing this 5-hit combo. Okay, let me just walk back and wait a few seconds for him to finish. Okay, he's done with that. Okay, hit the head, rinse and repeat for like 5 to 10 minutes. It honestly just gets kind of boring. But with that said, I still think it's a really high quality boss fight, but I think the simplicity and huge telegraphs of all of his attacks are enough to keep him from the S tier. Alright, moving on. Deacons of the Deep. You know, I'm actually gonna give this fight a C. I think it's at least fairly passable as a boss fight, at least on a first playthrough. Because I think it's probably the best of the trash mob bosses in the series. Not that this is saying much, but it actually has a gimmick to it. And they actually have a fairly decent attack. What with the curse spirit bomb and creating the cloud. For that, I'd say it's at least a fairly passable boss fight. But when I put it in the C range, I think it's like very low C minus, like barely passing. Actually, you know what? Now that I think about it, I'll make it a D. All the good things I praised it for would only ever work on your first playthrough. Like, if you know to just interrupt the attacks of the ones forming the cursed spirit bombs, you can stop it. Like, the only kind of redeeming qualities only really work if you don't know the fight. And it's kind of boring on repeat playthroughs when the Pope and his squad of fat boys appear and just block you. I think it's kind of deserving of a T now, or a D now that I think about it more. I wouldn't say it's completely trash tier, because it does actually kind of feel like a fight, unlike Ancient Wyvern. But yeah, I think D is probably a better rating once I thought about it more. Let me clarify though that I don't actually hate the fight. Oh shit, that alarm. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but there's an alarm going off in my house. Alright. Demon Princes. Oh, sorry, Jenny. You're gonna be triggered again, but I'm actually putting the Demon Princes at an S tier. I think this is a gank fight done very well. I really like how, from just a pure mechanics perspective, you're able to separate the Demon Princes in the first phase. How they switch from being aggressive and passive, and you have to know when to attack. They also have a pretty good variety of attacks that I think are fun to dodge and learn. And the second phase, I really like how the special move they do in the second phase is determined based on which one you kill first. And then the added AoEs look really cool. They add a lot to the fights. I think it's a very high quality boss fight. Probably, I'd say the gank fight here rivals ONS even. Alright, moving on. Dragon Slayer armor. You know, I hear a lot of mixed feelings on this, but I personally think it's just a C tier boss. There's nothing particularly special about the fight. I mean, it's decent, I'd say, but it's just a big guy swinging around an axe, like nothing particularly memorable or special about it. In fact, I'd say the only thing that makes it special are the giant zombie butterfly things that shoot fire at you from the side, which I think is a negative thing in the fight. Other than that, he's pretty, like, it's a decent enemy to fight, but there's nothing particularly special or memorable about him at all. So I'm just gonna put him in the C range. Yeah, that too, Jenny. And by the way, I think he's a much better fight there without the off-screen giant butterfly things shooting shit at you. Alright, moving on to Half-Light. Now, obviously, it's impossible to judge what a PvP encounter would be like, because obviously that would depend on the skill of the person that's being summoned. So for the sake of this list, I'll only evaluate it based on the NPC fight, which honestly I feel is trash tier. Like, honestly, the Desert Pyromancer you fight in this DLC before the Demon Prince is more of a boss than the NPC version of Half-Light. Now, I like the idea of this fight, I like being the boss. I think that added a pretty interesting element to the game, but I'm only judging the gameplay aspect of the NPC version of it, and it's basically the same as all of the other just regular NPCs that are summoned throughout the game. In fact, I'd say it's not even the best of those fights, and because of that, it doesn't even like feel like a boss fight. So I think that deserves trash tier. Alright, moving on. The tutorial boss. I'm actually gonna give it a B. Not because it's a particularly interesting or memorable fight. Well, memorable if it's your first boss. But I think it does a really good job of fulfilling its role as a tutorial boss. Like, it's pretty simple, but not overly simple to where even a new player would be able to steamroll it, which I think serves its purpose really well as a tutorial boss. Now, obviously, to a series veteran, it's a joke, which is why I won't rate it higher, but I think an above average rating is good for Idux Gundyr. Oh, yeah, and cool design, too. Like, I imagine the first time you see him transform is going to be pretty memorable. Alright, moving on. Lothric and Lorien. I'm going to give this an A rating. I think it's definitely an above average fight. But the things that keep it out of the S tier, in my opinion, are sometimes I feel as though the teleporting is kind of obnoxious and unfair. Like sometimes they just teleport completely off screen and you don't even get to see what sword attack he's going to use on you. Now, that is pretty rare to happen, but I think that's enough to keep it from the S tier ranking. Also, I feel as though they could have done a lot more with the second phase. I feel as though Lothric should have been a lot more aggressive with the spells, because if you're staying close to him the whole time, then Lothric does almost nothing, and it's basically just a repeat of the first phase at times. I feel as though if they just made Lothric a bit more aggressive, and uh, he did things when you were close to them, it would have made the fight a lot better. But I think those two details are enough to keep this fight from the S tier. And yeah, you're right. I think he only has two attacks. Like, uh, the long range heavy spell, and then like all little, the basically soul mass things he throws in the air. Yeah, that I think they should have done more with him in that fight. But overall, I still think it's a really good fight. Uh, it actually forces you to time your rolls properly. Lorien is designed to roll catch panic rollers, which I think is good. But I just feel as though it was kind of a wasted opportunity with the second phase there. Okay, up next is Nameless King. And you know, I think he actually deserves. I'll give him an A rating. I was really close to putting him in the S tier, but I think there's a few uh, minor complaints that keep it away from the S tier. Now, I really like how the Nameless King's second phase attacks are intentionally delayed, which really screws with new players. Like, if you're panic rolling, you are gonna get absolutely destroyed, and the timing for his swings is pretty counterintuitive. It definitely takes a while to get used to, which I think is really good. But the first phase, yeah, you're right. I think they could have done a lot more with the first phase. I feel as though he's just way too slow in the first phase. Like, he attacks basically once every 10 seconds and otherwise just stands still there. I'm not exactly sure what I'd want them to change, but I feel as though the first phase could have been a lot more interesting than it is. But I think the second phase is pretty top tier. Actually, hold on, let me take that back. I feel as though it's actually a little too easy in that the lightning attack he does when his health goes down halfway in the second phase leaves him vulnerable for so long. I feel as though he should also have like an AoE at the same time he's doing like the lightning strike from the sky attack, which is the weapon art for the sword spear he has. I feel as though it's too easy to just get free hits on him at that point. Also, yeah, the camera in the first phase is also annoying. If you lock on, then you get screwed over. Now, granted, these are all pretty minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. I think it's overall a really good boss fight, but I think those things are enough to keep it out of the S tier. Alright, the Consumed King. Hmm, I'll give this a D. I think this was also kind of a wasted opportunity. Well, you see, the problem I have with this fight is that if you get under him, well, the first phase is a complete joke, he's super slow. But for the second phase, if you just stay under him the whole time, then you're pretty much invincible. Like, the only attack he has that can actually hit you in the second phase if you're under him is the super telegraphed spin attack he does. So basically, if you just stay under him, you can freely slash away forever. And because of that, it's just a bad fight in my opinion. I feel as though they could have done that a lot better. Yeah, D plus. Oh yeah, and his instant charge attack is bullshit. His attacks range from either complete bullshit with the lunge attack he does to painfully simplistic and easy to avoid if you're just staying under him the whole time. So, yeah, he gets a D. Old Demon King. No, I actually kind of like this boss. In fact, I'm gonna go so far as to give it a B rating. I think he's actually pretty interesting to fight if you're using a melee build. Like, obviously, you can easily cheese him with a ranged build. But with a melee build, he's actually a pretty interesting fight, I think, with his countless AoE attacks. And a lot of that, he's pretty fast to react with a lot of them. But I think it's a fairly above average, decent fight, actually. My only problem here is that I think he leaves himself too vulnerable when he does the meteor attack in the second phase. It takes him like a good 10 seconds to charge it up, and they're really easy to avoid. So you basically just get a ton of free hits in when he does the meteor attack. I feel as though maybe he should have created like a fire barrier around himself or something that would damage you if you got close when he did that, or maybe make it take like half the time to charge it up. But other than that, I think it's a pretty solid fight if you're using a melee build. Alright, Pontiff Sullivan. I really want to give this an S tier ranking, but I think there's just one major flaw that keeps him away from it. That being, I think they make him way too vulnerable when he spawns in his clone. As far as game mechanics go and atmosphere and music, it's really good. He has complex and really fun to dodge combos, and I really think the clone thing he does in the second phase and more passive ranged attacks makes it a really good fight gameplay wise. But my biggest problem is that when he summons his clone, he stands still for such a long time, completely unprotected, and you can just get tons of free hits in. I feel as though he should have kept like that same AoE barrier around him when he goes into the second phase, when he summons his clone. I think that would have, if they did that, it would have been S tier for sure. Alright, Sister Freda, like, Yeah, that's S tier, no questions asked. Absolutely fantastic, top tier fight. Every phase has something interesting about it. She has pretty fast scythe attacks that are pretty hard to dodge in the first phase, and the invisibility thing. Phase 2 is again, I think, a gank battle done right. You have her being passive, while the second one is really slow but hits really hard. Definitely has a good ONS dynamic to it. And phase 3 is just absolutely incredible. Non-stop torrent of high damage, magic, and scythe attacks coming at you. Really good top tier fights. Moving on. You can tell where she jumps based on the right, that too. I really like uh how difficult the first phase is depends on how fast you figure out how to find her while she's invisible. Overall, really good fights. I really have. Okay, I have one minor complaint, but I don't think it's enough to knock her down from the S tier. I think she's a bit too fast for the mechanics of the game. Like, after she completes a combo and you think you'll be able to get a hit in, she can just pretty much immediately run or jump like 10 feet backwards immediately after completing a combo, which I think is slightly bullshit, but I don't think that's a big enough complaint to keep her out of the S tier. Alright, moving along, we have Slave Knight Gale, which I think is definitely the best fight in the game. Like, everything about it is incredible. First phase is basically just a straight up melee fight, and he has some pretty interesting melee attacks that require quite a bit of a learning curve. His attacks have delays, they're a bit erratic and hard to read. Then the second phase, where he has a massive arsenal of attacks, like the automatic crossbow, the destructo disc things he throws at you, along with pretty complex melee attacks that involve his cape, even. And then the third phase, holy shit, if that's not the most epic atmosphere I've ever seen in a boss fight. There's lightning all around. You have like the dark magic skull things that roar every time they appear that just adds to the atmosphere of the fight, all while he's doing insane flips at you, and even mid flip he shoots his auto crossbow at you. Just such an epic fight in every way. Alright, Soul of Cinder. I'm gonna give this an A. Alright, so he probably has the most he probably has the widest variety of attacks out of any enemy in the game, at least in the first phase. He has 4 different builds with a variety of different attacks. Uh, Not really much else to say about the first phase, just a lot of different attacks to memorize, lots of variety. Sometimes he even combines them, like homing Soul Mass with a melee build. Really interesting fight. And then the second phase, yeah, the fan service to Gwen is obviously really good. And he's basically an improved Gwen. He has more complex, more interesting movesets than Gwen did, and he actually uses lightning attacks and a variety of them at that. And the soundtrack is incredible too. But honestly, I don't even really think anything holds it back. I think Soul of Cinder honestly deserves an S tier. Like, I can't really even think of any downsides to the fight. I think it's a really solid fight. A very wide variety of moves, quality boss, and uh, great atmosphere as well with the music and whatnot. And also, he can't be parried, that too. Good thing to point out. Alright. Next up, we have Fort. Um, I'll give it a C here. I think it's a decent boss for its point in the game. But my main problem with it is that if you get under him, then you're pretty much invincible. Like, he's absolutely incapable of damaging you in any way if you're underneath him. Like, I know it's not supposed to be too hard because it's an early game fight, but I mean, I think that's a bit too ridiculous in my opinion. I feel as though if they gave him at least some form of defense while you were under him, I'd probably rate him higher. But as far as challenge goes, it's just completely lacking the second you figure that out. Alright, moving on. Yeah, the Vape Lord Skeleton. So, this shitty gimmick fight doesn't even really feel like a fight. And sometimes it can even be annoying because sometimes he basically just drags his last bracelet thing into the fog and you just have to sit there waiting for him to move. Absolutely none of his attacks are interesting in any way. It takes him literal years to do any of his melee attacks or anything. Like, the only ways in which you would ever die in this fight, if you know what you're doing, are from things completely outside of your control. Like him all of a sudden moving forward unexpectedly and being insta-killed by the vape, or him just keeping his bracelet in the vape smoke nonstop while an army of skeletons start attacking you. Really boring, really a shit fight, and it can just punish you in dumb ways outside of your control. Yeah, I think that deserves to be trashed here. Alright, last boss on the list, Yorm the Giant. And you know, I'm actually gonna give it a C. Why? Because outside of the Storm Ruler, it's actually viable to fight him if you know what you're doing. You just have. Now, obviously, with the Storm Ruler, it's a complete gimmick, but unlike Ancient Wyvern, fighting him without the gimmick is actually viable and not super tedious. So, for that reason, I'll give him a C, because if you know how to properly fight him without the gimmick, then it's a fairly passable boss fight, I'd say at least. Not amazing by any means, but at the very least passable. And the fact that there's a viable alternative to the gimmick, I think gives it at least a grade of a C. Alright, well, that was fun.